edition of Focus on Homelessness. The meeting is being recorded, as you heard there. I hope that's okay with everyone. We'll be able to circulate it after this. So thank you for joining us. This morning, we are launching the summary edition of Focus on Homelessness, which is produced by Focus Ireland in partnership with the School of Social Work and Social Policy at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Rosemary Hennigan. I'm the Policy Coordinator and I will be chairing this morning's event. So for those who may not have seen the Focus on Homelessness series so far, it brings together some key statistics and insights into the nature of homelessness here in Ireland since the start of the current crisis in 2014. And this morning, we're launching a summary edition which draws together the full series in one place. And we hope this will provide an easily accessible resource for understanding the figures underpinning homelessness in Ireland. Focus Ireland believes that to prevent and indeed to end homelessness, you need to understand its causes, as well as understanding the impact our current policy responses have had over the past 7 years or so in addressing homelessness. And so this morning, we have Owen O'Sullivan, Professor of Social Policy and Fellow of Trinity College Dublin, who will take us through some of the main research findings in the Focus on Homelessness series. Owen is a member of the European Observatory on Homelessness and editor of the European Journal of Homelessness, and he's lead editor of the Focus on Homelessness series as well. Our second speaker then will be Suzanne Fitzpatrick, who is Professor of Housing and Social Policy and Director of the Institute for Social Policy, Housing and Equalities Research at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. Suzanne is Principal Investigator of the Homelessness Monitor series, which collates evidence on homelessness in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. She is a lead researcher for the Chicago-based Institute of Global Homelessness, and she'll be giving us an international perspective and putting the Irish outlook in context. And then our third speaker is Mike Allen, who is Director of Advocacy, Research and Communications at Focus Ireland. He was President of FIANSA, which is the European Network for Homeless Organisations, between 2013 and 2016, and is a member of the European Observatory on Homelessness, as well as the Chair of the European Housing First Hub. So Mike will be speaking to the policy implications of the research presented today. So just before we begin, I would ask that you will keep your microphones muted for the presentations, but there will be an opportunity for a Q&A at the end. And please do use the chat box for any questions which might occur to you during the presentations. So on that note, when you're ready to begin, Owen, take us away.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Yeah, this is a summary of the summary report. So very briefly, just to go through a couple of the key indicators. Firstly, looking at trends based on the point in time monthly data. And this is the data that most people are familiar with. It's published every month, usually on the last Friday of every month, and has been published since April 2014. And that gives us a snapshot of the number of households in emergency accommodation each month over that period. There are a small number of exclusions of 1 or 2 hostels that aren't included because they don't receive local authority funding, but by and large, the vast majority of services are included in this data. And we can see that there was a pretty steady increase from mid-2014, reaching a peak at the end of 2019, with over 6,000, just under 6,000 households in emergency accommodation. And since then, the numbers has declined somewhat and then remained kind of plateaued over the last year or so, at about 5,600 households. However, that does conceal a number of quite interesting trends. One is what we see here is the same numbers, but based on the households in Dublin and outside of Dublin, and about 2/3, just over 2/3 of the households on a monthly basis, at a point in time monthly basis, are enumerated in Dublin. But what we're seeing is a divergence here. We can see the same data. This is for families and adult-only households, or single persons households. So we can see a pretty steady decline, the blue line at the bottom, in the number of families in emergency accommodation, but a steady increase in the number of adult-only households over that period. So that kind of plateauing that we've seen over the last year and a half conceals a significant drop in the number of families and an equally significant ongoing increase in the number of adult-only households in emergency accommodation. Equally, we can see outside of Dublin that the number of adult-only households has not grown. It's been pretty flat, really, since the beginning of 2019. It had increased over that period and then hit a peak, really, in early 2019, and has remained pretty steady ever since, whereas the increase in the number of adult-only households is largely in Dublin. And equally, when we look at that by gender, the number of women in emergency accommodation can hit a peak of 1,000 in early 2019, and again has remained pretty steady ever since, whereas the number of adult males has continued to increase. So that large increase we're seeing in single households is largely men and largely in Dublin. But we suggest in the report that this data, while quite helpful, conceals an awful lot. So when we look at the dynamics, as we call it, of homelessness, when we look at the number of new adult entries into emergency accommodation by quarter, we see that over 38,000 adults, unique adults, entered emergency accommodation for the first time over that period from Q1 2014 to Q2 2021. So, and we kind of know this from kind of point period and point prevalence data, that the longer the period you take, the more people you will count as having an experience of homelessness. So over that period of time, just under 40,000 adults entered emergency accommodation for the first time. So when we look at the point in time figure, we are seeing that 5,000 to 6,000 households. When we look at it over a longer period of time, we see a much larger number of adults who've had an experience in emergency accommodation. And I think Suzanne will talk to us. This is quite a narrow definition of homelessness. It's really ethos category 2 and 3, people in emergency accommodation. But even with that limited definition, an extraordinary number of people have had a stay or a spell in emergency accommodation between 2014 and the first quarter of 2021. When we look at that in terms of Dublin and outside of Dublin, again, we see a slightly different pattern than we see from the point in time data, the monthly figures. So here we see that almost half the new entries to emergency accommodation were in Dublin, the other half outside of Dublin, whereas at a point in time, nearly 3/4 of people in emergency accommodation are in Dublin compared to a quarter outside of Dublin. So almost equal numbers of households entering emergency accommodation from Dublin and outside of Dublin over that period. And one of the reasons why at a point in time there are more people in Dublin is that they are getting stuck in emergency accommodation for much longer periods of time than outside of Dublin. So we can see here in this data, the number of adults in emergency accommodation for more than 6 months. So the orange or reddish line is outside of Dublin. So you can see there that the numbers reached a kind of peak of about 1,000 in Q3 2019 and has remained pretty steady with a slight decrease over that period. Whereas in Dublin, the numbers in emergency accommodation for more than 6 months increased from just over 500 to over 3,000 at Q4 2020, albeit with a significant decrease then in Q1 2021. But still, a large number of people clearly getting stuck in emergency accommodation in Dublin. Therefore, at a point in time, they're being captured more and more in that point in time data. So given that there's a very significant number of people who have entered emergency accommodation and then are getting stuck, it's still a bit of a puzzle. Why do we have only 5,500 people in emergency accommodation at the moment? And that's because a very significant number of households have exited emergency accommodation. So about 23,000 households have exited emergency accommodation to housing over that same period of time, either to local authority, approved housing bodies, private rented sector with rent supplement in the early days, and increasingly with the housing assistance payment. So our system is quite good at getting lots of people out of emergency accommodation into housing. And again, that tells us something about the dynamics and the characteristics of homelessness in Ireland, that there's nothing wrong with the majority of people entering emergency accommodation. They don't have complex needs. They simply need access to housing. And once provided with that housing, either through a tenancy or a social housing support, are able to maintain that tenancy without any difficulty. So kind of a very significant number of households entering into emergency accommodation, but also very significant numbers exiting to housing again. We have some data on the numbers who exit to non-housing exits. That is usually to friends or families or doubling up or to other institutions. They're not included in that figure because they're inherently unstable exits rather than these far more stable exits. One second. And of course, having all those numbers of people in emergency accommodation is particularly expensive. So we can see the Section 10 funding or public expenditure funding in homelessness has increased significantly over that period from about just over 50 million in 2014 to over 200 million by 2020. But the majority of that, 80% of that funding going on emergency accommodation. So in the language that we've used in the report on the financing of homelessness, the bulk of this expenditure is passive expenditure in that it simply maintains people in emergency accommodation rather than it being active expenditure that gets people out of emergency accommodation. So that in brief is, I think, some of the key trends that in one sense, the point in time figure that we're most familiar with doesn't really tell us an awful lot about homelessness in Ireland. It's the flow data that tells us that this extraordinary number of people who had a spell in emergency accommodation, but that they're able to successfully exit emergency accommodation, and in many cases relatively quickly, and particularly outside of Dublin. And that's why at a point in time, there's a relatively small number of people in emergency accommodation in Dublin or outside of Dublin compared to Dublin. But it is an extraordinarily costly system to those who both experience homelessness and to the central government and local authorities that fund homeless services. So I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's incredibly interesting data, I think, and very, very useful to have and to have it in that framework. So thank you very much for presenting that. Suzanne, when you're ready, if you want to take us away.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Mike and colleagues for giving me this opportunity to respond to the report. And it's very nice from a UK perspective, where as Rosemary outlined, I lead a somewhat similar project, which is the Homelessness Monitor, which attempts to present a kind of state of the nation account of where we're at in homelessness in England on an annual basis, and the other UK countries on a rotating basis. And in many ways, what we've tried to do with that project is very similar to what's been achieved here in this report, which is to bring the data, mostly data that already exists, although we do generate some data of our own as well, but mostly to bring the data that already exists into an accessible format. And you can't underestimate the importance of having things all in the one place. It just makes such a difference to the extent to which people can use it and will use it. And I know that's one of the main benefits that people have told us about the Homelessness Monitor. So really pleased to see this output in Ireland as well. And it's really useful for people like myself from outside Ireland to have that starting point to understand what's going on. I mean, I just want to pick up on a number of the sort of themes that Owen touched on, or just my own reactions to reading the report, possibly in not a particularly logical order, but I'll run through them anyway, and hopefully there'll be some points for discussion. First of all, I'd really like to reinforce what Owen was saying about the importance of what I would describe as case record data, enabling to look at the dynamics, in other words, data that's attached to individual identifiers, so you can look at the total numbers of people going through the system, and also the inflows and outflows, because that's really what tells you fundamentally what's going on, how long people are stuck in the system, how many people in total are affected, and so on. And this is something that we've actually only recently acquired in England, with we passed new legislation in England in the form of the Homelessness Reduction Act in 2017, and accompanying that was a new data system called HClick that for the first time in England actually captures individual case record data on homeless households going through the system. Almost unbelievably, before that, even though we've had legislation in place since 1977, in England all we had was headcount data, and pretty crude headcount data at that. So that's been a massive step forward, but quite a recent one in England, which enables us to do some of the same sorts of analysis. that Owen's presented here. We have in Scotland for a much longer period had something called HL1 that again is unique identifiers and allows us to look at the total number of people going through the system. And chiming with something that Owen's found and colleagues have found in Ireland, doing well, it's actually a 20-year analysis of the number of unique individuals going through, or unique adults, I should say, going through the homelessness system in Scotland. It's almost 10% of Scots had presented at home as homeless at some point over a 20-year period. It was 9%. And again, as has been found in Ireland, for the great majority of those people, the need is a combination of housing need and poverty rather than complex needs. And people do exit the system and generally don't come back into it. But one thing I'd be interested to hear a bit more about is whether there's been any analysis in Ireland of repeat homelessness, so people who have been resettled but have come back into the system. We certainly found in Scotland that was a pretty small minority and a fairly predictable group, the people who do have those more complex needs that go beyond housing and homelessness. I totally agree with the argument in the report about the emphasis on households rather than individuals, because that determines what the key was, the pattern of response, in terms of the housing need that's being, or the extreme form of housing that's been articulated via people having to present as homeless. But of course, the profile of those households is also crucial rather than just the total number. And I was pleased to see the report was organised by effectively by household type. But I was also quite, in some ways, the profile of people presenting is quite similar in Ireland and in the UK, particularly in England, I'm thinking of. But in some ways it's a bit different as well, and I just wanted to throw that into the discussion to see if we can perhaps work out why. I'm just curious. Post the Homelessness Reduction Act in England, where, to cut a long story short, single people without children in the household had extended rights to assistance in England. They're not entitled to be rehoused, but they are entitled to have help to resolve their homelessness. Basically, that means a lot more single people have come into the system in England since that legislation came into force in 2018. And since that happened, we have about 70% of households who apply as homeless in England are single people, most of them single men. So there's quite a lot of similarity there with what's been found in Ireland. I think it's 83% of households are single in this report. And it's quite similar to the position in Scotland, where all single homeless people have been entitled to be rehoused for some time. About 70% of households who apply are single people. But the thing that's really quite different, and I'm curious about, is almost all of the others in the UK are lone parents, female-headed lone parents. We have minuscule numbers of any other kinds of households coming forward. As homeless is mostly single men. The second largest group is single women, and almost all the others are single lone parent women. The proportion of couples with children who are homeless in the UK is 1-2%. I mean, it's tiny. The number of kind of extended adult households is not much bigger. So it's quite different in terms of the profile of family homelessness, and I just wondered if that might be something that's worth picking up on. So I find that interesting. The age and gender profile looks very similar, in terms of it being really that middle age band, the 25 to 45 being the dominant age group, and relatively small numbers of younger people, although proportionately, it's certainly not a minor issue for under 25s. The gender profile is broadly similar as well. So I think the household type is quite interesting, and I just wondered what was going on with family homelessness. Also, family homelessness is a bigger chunk, obviously, in the UK as well. It's about a third, even post legislative change, that's offered more assistance to single people. So there's something that's a bit different between our countries there. I think another point that was really brought home to me by the analysis that Owen's just presented is the importance in distinguishing between the snapshot figures and what are effectively prevalence figures, or the inflow figures of people who are presenting. Because not only are the overall numbers very different, the profile of people affected will be very different as well. The snapshot will tend to overrepresent people who are stuck in the system for a long period of time. The inflow gives you that broader picture of people moving in and out. And as in Ireland, in the UK, that has a big impact on geography. So I noticed in, you know, if you look at a snapshot, Dublin obviously really dominates the snapshot. If you look at the longer period of low, Dublin remains very dominant. It's nowhere near as dominant. We have the very same in England. So in London, if you look at the numbers of people in temporary accommodation, which is a key metric that that's published in England on a quarterly basis, about 70 to 75% of people will be in London. But if you look at the people who are accepted as homeless over the course of a year, it's only 25% are in London. So it makes a fundamental difference whether you're looking at a snapshot figure or you're looking at the numbers of people coming through the system over the course of a year. And then that makes a big difference to things like, for example, Shelter recently, over a couple of years ago, published data about the proportion of households who were in work, who were accepted as statutorily homeless in the UK. In other words, accepted by local authorities as those authorities having a rehousing duty towards them. And they said, I think they found it was 60% were in work, but that was very heavily a London phenomenon. So if you look at a snapshot, there's quite a high proportion of people are in work because it's much more common in London. But if you look over the course of a year, the proportion falls to 20% or something like that. So it's a really important difference. It's almost the first thing you should ask. Are you talking about a snapshot? Are you talking about an inflow over time? In terms of geography, it makes a difference, but also in terms of profile and support needs, it makes a difference because people with complex needs will tend to be in the UK in the system longer. And so if you look at snapshots, they will be very heavily represented. If you look at the profile over the course of a year, the overall level of sort of complex needs will be lower. Just reflecting as I suppose as an outsider on the report and on the patterns that it reveals in Ireland. I mean, I was really struck by the sort of simplicity in a way of the report, the starkness of the analysis and the power that comes with that. You know, it's just extraordinarily clear, and some of those graphs were just so told such a clear story in terms of this upsurge from 2014 and then the kind of plateauing or even sort of at the beginning of a reversal from 2018 before obviously COVID then hit and brought about some fundamental changes. The big distinctions between Dublin and the rest of the country, the difference in patterns between single households and family households and so on. But of course, as an outsider, I just kept wanting to ask why questions. You know, what happened in 2018? What is this down to policy? I mean, we often find in the UK that actually there's a pretty abrupt changes in trend data comes about from policy, particularly around rough sleeping and targeted interventions there. Of course, interested to know if were these market changes, policy changes, or other reasons. Clearly a lot of that change was very concentrated among single men in Dublin. So what happened? Was there an intervention there that's successful that we can learn from? There's also some other contextual stuff that I would find really interesting to know more about what are the causes. I mean, I think the triggers, I mean, Owen hinted at it in terms of certainly we can draw an inference from the fact that people move out of the system quite quickly, that they're unlikely to have complex needs. So what is driving people into the system in the first place? And what does this emergency accommodation look like? I found myself asking this question. I know it's presented, the split between private providers and NGOs is presented, but are these hostels, shelters, that kind of thing, or are they ordinary mainstream accommodation let on a temporary basis, or some combination of the two? And what's the criteria for accessing it? I mean, in the UK, as some of you may know, we have this very kind of detailed set of legal criteria that determine access to rehousing by local authorities. As I mentioned a little while ago, we've widened some of that criteria in terms of single homeless people having access to more help than they once did. But rehousing in England, at least, is still limited to mostly families with children and exceptionally vulnerable adults. But it looks to me from this data that it's a much more open system in Ireland, and that's be interesting to find out a bit more about that and what implications it has for policy. But the final point I want to make is just how struck I was by figure 20. I mean, that is some figure, and I would have thought it would focus the minds of policymakers. That you see this incredible increase in the costs of the homelessness system, a disproportionate increase even as compared with the numbers of people coming into the system, and of course a huge growth in the amount of spending on private for-profit providers there. If I've interpreted it correctly, it's went from 11 million, was it, in 2013 to 123 million by the most recent year in terms of expenditure on for-profit providers of emergency accommodation. I mean, that's an astonishing increase, and interested to find out a bit more about what lies behind that, aside from just the additional numbers of people coming through the system. To some extent, it depends on what the nature of that accommodation is. Is it decent accommodation, or is it something? Are you paying for a system, as we often are in the UK, on, say, bed and breakfast accommodation in London, which is pretty appalling and also very expensive. But of course, regardless of the quality of the accommodation, it's still emergency provision. It's not a secure, stable home for people, and it's not something that you want people to be having to work through or to kind of experience unless it's absolutely necessary. And I very much like this distinction that was drawn between passive and active expenditure. That's definitely a lesson I'll pick up from this report and take back to my own work in the UK, because I think it's a really powerful distinction to draw. And I mean, sometimes in the UK we do talk about, having to draw, or the increase the increased concentration on expenditure that's focused on the crisis end of things, crisis accommodation, temporary accommodation, and so on. And the equivalent pattern in England, at least because the policy and resources are very different in different parts of the UK, but in England, is we've actually had a reduced amount of expenditure on homelessness since 2010, even though the number of homeless people has increased until very recently. And within that diminishing set of resources, because this is mostly local authority expenditure, and they have been very hard hit by austerity cuts, cuts in budgets associated with the austerity measures post 2010. So the overall amount of expenditure on homelessness has actually gone down, but a far larger proportion of it is spent on temporary accommodation in London. So to some extent there are some parallels there, but the overall amount of money has gone down. And of course, effectively that means we have moved massively from a more active, under the Labour government pre-2010, there was actually a real shift towards various forms of floating support and preventative work and so on, and now it's really heavily moved in the direction of supporting or paying for temporary accommodation, because local authorities have an absolute statutory duty to provide that. So they've cut things back to what they have a statutory duty to provide, given the pressures on them. So just by way of conclusion, I can certainly see some strong parallels between our experience in the UK, and I focus mostly on England there, and Ireland, but also some distinctions as well. And I look forward to hearing a bit more about some of the why questions, and also people's reflections on some of those parallels and differences. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. That was really interesting and very astute, I think, in terms of your observations. We did that. The report is, we had to kind of resist the urge to narrate it a lot. So as you say, it is a little bit stark, I suppose, because what we wanted to do is kind of have the stats and the statistics out there, and then to have that as a kind of an agreed basis, a kind of a clean, here are just the facts. But now I think it's time to definitely look at the whys, and to have a look at the policy context, and to say, well, what does this mean for our policy decisions? And to do that, we have with us Mike Allen. So Mike, when you're ready, go ahead. No pressure.
Thanks, Rosemary. As Suzanne was analysing the report and going through those, as I say, very interesting questions, I started off jotting them down with a view to seeing to what extent I could respond to them. But after a period of time, I thought that's just an agenda for a much longer investigation in what happens next. So I might touch on them, but I think there are a lot of really important questions. And getting that, I mean, what we've been trying to do with Trinity College in this Focus on Homelessness process is put out the data which the department and the local authorities have spent a huge amount of time collecting, but putting it out in a way which you can inform public debate. I think it's been a really useful project. I think that we are only just started the process of informing the public debate. We made a very definite decision that Rosemary referred to, that the Focus on Homelessness series, we didn't even analyze the material. We're trying to get the data out there to hope to create a place where a wider group of people start to analyze it. And our sense was, if we started to put on particularly a Focus Ireland analysis of what it meant, in a sense that it would become contentious rather than a source of debate. And I think that's a really important project. The Jesuit Centre of Faith and Justice, Keith's here, I think is one of the few organisations which is also participating in that debate. And it would be really good to see a much deeper investigation and public discussion of what this data means. So for me, the first policy conclusion from what we've done is that the data is important. The data we presented is all official data. So it's really important to recognise, and it comes out in certainly what Suzanne was saying, that way of counting the data is in a sense a reflection or an echo of the way that the legal system defines homelessness. So you get this sort of back and forward. If you change the legal definition of homelessness, the numbers would change. If you change the system, then the numbers would change. That's something really important to remember. So the second sort of, I think, the big conclusion, I think, really policy message we would like to come from it is this shift back to counting households. There is not going to be a day, there's never, when organisations like Focus Ireland and all the other organisations that engage with homelessness isn't going to talk about the number of human beings who are homeless. We're always going to refer to the number of men, women and children, because that's the emotional content of it, and it's extraordinarily important. But when we're talking about policy, we need to be talking about housing. And if there's a shift by the department to start trying to make the number of households the key measure of homelessness, it's important organisations like Focus Ireland and others to support them in doing that, while they would also recognise that we have other good reasons to mention the other dimensions of homelessness and the human dimensions as well. And it's a really important thing to realise in this data that it's actually Owen O'Sullivan who generated that household number. There is not an official household figure. We had to estimate that from the other information that we have. And that's a really significant point in terms of, if your goal is to end homelessness, the crucial measure is the number of households you have to provide with a home, not just the number of individuals who are suffering from the problem. And when the state isn't actually counting the number of households, it's a bit of an indication that there's a mismatch between the data it's producing and the solution it's trying to provide. So we would very strongly support a shift towards having an official calculation of households experiencing homelessness and having that as a crucial dimension. The other thing that really emerges is a complex picture. I mean, the public debate of this is, oh, it's turned a corner, it's going up, it's going down. And of course, in recent months, the media is much less interested in homelessness at all, simply because it's neither going up nor going down. But that complex picture is important. And it's really important to say that while there has been a dramatic fall, particularly in family homelessness since COVID-19 and the tenancy protection measures, there's two really important things to say about that, is that the decline in family homelessness seems to have started before that. So we don't know what that's about. We know a few things about it. We know there's a shift in the number of lone parents who are in the families that are homeless, a decline in the proportion of lone parents over that sort of period of time. We don't know why. And we don't know whether it's going to last. In terms of some of the questions that Suzanne is raising, I think they're really interesting. Like, one of the unique driving factors in family homelessness in Ireland, and maybe single people's homelessness, has been a decline in number of, I wouldn't say, I don't want to exaggerate it, but a significant number of private landlords have left the market. Probably partly as an aftermath of a huge growth, tax incentivized growth in private landlordism during the Celtic Tiger eras, and many of those landlords leaving the market. But we don't know, for such a significant factor of landlords leaving the market. We actually have no published information about why that's happening. We of course have all the jeremiads and prophecies of doom from the landlord representative organizations, but they tend not to reflect the realities of their own members. So we don't know what's happening there. But so the significant extent that you have families driven into homelessness simply because their landlord is leaving the market, selling up, and under the Irish legislation, you can evict somebody even in a long-term lease in those circumstances. But that doesn't give you any explanation of why that should predominantly impact on single-parent families, and why there was such a high percentage of single-parent families in the mix. So there's a lot of important questions there. It's also important, I think one of the really strong things that comes from those graphs is to remind us of what you might call a numbing effect of social problems that accelerate rapidly and then moderate but don't come down. And so you have currently maybe 3 or 4 times the level of family homelessness and single people's homelessness that there was a few years ago. And a few years ago, it was utterly unacceptable to everybody who commentated publicly about it that we had these levels. They're now much, much higher, but because they've stopped going up, they seem to drift into a position where they become socially and politically acceptable. And you get sort of statements by government people that, oh, it's great news, it's gone down. It's gone down to a level which is 3 times what was considered an unacceptable level before. And that's really important in these time series graphs to remind us of where we've come from, and to some extent where we want to go back to. That's as much a political question as a policy question, but it is really about what, do we have a policy which is about an acceptable level of managed homelessness, or is it a policy of ending homelessness? And the Irish government's decision to sign up to the European Union's new declaration on homelessness, which includes the commitment to ending homelessness, is by 2030. The Irish government, I think, wisely put it in the context that they were working towards that and they'd review as they went along. But I think it's not about the date that's set. It's about what does that mean for the sorts of policies and sorts of analysis that we need. A third sort of dimension, which I think is important in terms of the complexity, is the regional picture. So in Ireland, there is a process that if somebody says something is happening in Dublin, it is inevitable that somebody will come along and say that this is also happening in non-Dublin areas and we shouldn't be so dominated by Dublin. And that sort of distorts debate, and you can't really get a sort of a thing. Some things happen much more in non-Dublin areas and some things happen mostly in Dublin. So some of these factors are very, the continued growth of homelessness is very much concentrated around Dublin, and the declines in a number of areas come very, very much sooner and are very much marked. Now, what we don't know, if you're in Dublin Regional Homeless Executive, you might well be saying that's because people who have become homeless due to the conditions in those non-Dublin areas are coming to Dublin because of the scale and quality of the homeless services there. And inevitably that is part of the picture. But to what extent is that part of the picture, and to what extent are people being made homeless in Dublin? That's a really important question. And the question that follows out of that is what do we draw from that on a policy level? You could say, and we currently do say, that if you're homeless, you should be homeless where you were previously housed and you should stay there. And yet we know that the stigma and other negative effects of becoming homeless can make that very difficult for people. And there's a world trend of people moving to more anonymous and larger centres, where it can often be easier to solve their problems than if they stayed where they were. So you might move to a position where you just recognise that people within Ireland are going to move around if they become homeless, and that you might develop specialist and additional skills in Dublin to deal with that human factor, rather than constantly tell somebody who's going through an extraordinary crisis in their life that they ought to go back to where they came from. I think that's a really important set of questions about the regional analysis in here. And the next focus on homelessness that we're currently working on will go more deeply into the regional analysis. The 2 final points I want to mention have already been mentioned by Owen and Suzanne, and they're about what we make of this 38,000 figure of 38,000 unique adults. We have no notion of what that was for children. And there would be a truly frightening figure for children, in that we know that simply the experience of being homeless, of losing your home, ending up in homeless accommodation, is in itself traumatic for children. We don't know what the figures are because those aren't collected in the same way. But the 38,000 figures for adults, I think it invites us to think of homelessness in a completely different way. The debate about homelessness over the COVID period, and I think before that, has been about we need to look at the homeless as a group who have a particular set of problems which explain why they're homeless. I mean, quite clearly, 38,000 people do not have that level of mental health problem. They do not have that level of addiction issues and so on. There's a whole range of things going on with that group of people, which need us to ask the question, why do so many people end up needing emergency accommodation? But we also need to reflect on how successful the homeless sector is in supporting, and the local authorities are in supporting people out of homelessness. I mean, I think the point is made both by Suzanne and Owen, and it's correct that many of those people moved out of homelessness because they've no needs and they didn't need any support. But there's also a group in there who didn't need much support, but they needed a bit of support, and they certainly needed sympathy and explanation of the system when they found themselves in the crisis. But so the success in local authorities and the homeless organizations in that number is really important. But it also, if you look at it as a system, you can't have a homeless system which has got that amount of throughput. If you think of it as the overheating of the system, as that number of people going through. When I started about 10 years ago with Focus Ireland, the objective was, and we were very near it, that every household that became homeless would have a case manager, and that case manager would work with them. Now, obviously, if people don't need that because they're going to move out quickly, that's fine. But in the current system, there are very large numbers of people with moderate to high complex needs who have no case manager. And that brings us, and that's because the system is overheated because it's trying to deal with a set of challenges which really the homeless sector shouldn't be. They need to be dealt with upstream, as it were, in terms of what is driving people into homelessness. Brings you to the last point, which is this active and passive. And we drew on this from what started off as quite controversial, but proved to be a very successful shift in thinking about unemployment and long-term unemployment, of a movement from passive labour market measures, which essentially you do the essential job of making sure somebody doesn't starve or become homeless if they lose their job, but you just give them an income, which is a passive thing, which is crucial. It's not to dismiss it as important. And you move to an active, where you look at their training needs, you look at their job-seeking skills, you look at the types of things and how they operate in the labour market. And that had a huge impact on the nature of long-term homelessness in Ireland and elsewhere. It's not a simple, once you introduce the idea, the next thing you have is a row about what sort of measure it falls into each category, and it's an important discussion. But rather than sort of, at the moment, the analysis of how we're spending our money doesn't allow you to look behind it very effectively. And it may lead us to a sort of, we're spending too much argument and therefore cutbacks. Of course, we're spending too much because the problem's too large. What we need to do is analyze what we're spending the money on to be more effective. And this concept of having a fundamental analysis between what we're spending on things which are just passive, giving people a roof over their head, giving them food to eat, crucial things, not dismissing them. But we need to be increasing the proportion of our resources that we're putting into active measures which actually change the circumstances which have people homeless in the first place. And if there was, a policy concept which came out of this and could be embedded into the European Declaration on Homelessness and the European thinking, to take that sort of notion of active and passive measures on homelessness would probably be the long-term most significant. So thanks, Rosemary.
That's great. Thanks very much, Mike. A lot to think about there, I think, and we'll all agree. We're going to have a quick Q&A now. I actually have 15 minutes for Q&A. So there are some questions which I already have coming through and some questions which I think maybe Suzanne has raised as well. So both Mike and Owen might have a chance to kind of respond to those. What I'll do is I'll probably put the questions to our panelists, if that's all right with everyone. It's just kind of an easier way to do it. So if you use the chat box to ask those questions, I'll then ask our panelists as we go. So the first question we have is from Keith Adams, who would like to ask Owen O'Sullivan if there is an equivalent estimation for the number of children who've experienced homelessness in the last 7 years, or are there gaps in the published data to prevent us kind of seeing how many children have been affected or have been through emergency accommodation since this latest crisis began?
The answer is no. The that the data on the flow into emergency accommodation comes from the performance reports that are published on a quarterly basis by the 9 lead authorities, but they only provide data on the number of unique adults. So we don't know the number of households, nor do we know the number of child dependents on a basis. We only know the child dependents on a point-in-time basis.
I think it would be an interesting area though, because presumably there's been quite a lot of children affected by this, and obviously there is research which suggests that an early life experience of homelessness might be an indicator of future experience of homelessness in adulthood as well. So it'd be an interesting area, I think, to look further into. I have a question here from Anne-Maria Riley, which is for Mike. She was wondering if you could give some example of active measures which we might kind of consider instead of those passive measures we've been concentrating on.
I think one I sort of touched on really is the most obvious one is case management, that you're actually using some of your resources to employ somebody who is going to do the work that Anne-Marie used to do with Focus Ireland, of working with the individual. But I think this is where the problem of the definition comes in, because you can have a case manager who's basically spending all their time helping the individual to manage their experience of homelessness, rather than a case manager who is doing that only in as much as it's necessary to create the foundation for the person to move on, and it's primarily focused on that. So that's why when I say it's a really important sort of concept, it won't be easy, and I think that you need to look through the range of, for instance, case management or educational training measures, which include increase people's capacity of getting a job. One of the remarkable areas I've always thought in Ireland is that we've no expectation. I think we're one of the only European or British circumstances we seem to have no expectation that people moving out of homelessness would also try and engage in the labour market. We seem to dismiss the possibility that they might be able to do that. But once you've said that those sorts of measures are active measures, advice and information, I would say, is an active measure, you do then start to need to look in detail at the content of that activity to make sure that it is actually doing that. Because I think there is a tendency to shift. There's two tendencies. One is to shift activities. The homeless sector likes a crisis. It likes looking after people, and it has the tendency to hold on to people rather than try and move them on. And I think you would need to guard against that natural and very human tendency within the sector. And the other thing is, once you introduce a positive notion, everybody starts claiming that what they're doing is already doing that. And you'd very soon have various organisations who give soup and sandwiches who would be claiming that that was an active intervention. And you need to have quite a robust way of thinking about the idea. I'd be interested on that. I mean, I'm very pleased that Suzanne picked that up as a concept, but how, I'd be interested to hear her thoughts a little bit more on where that idea might go.
Suzanne, do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, very happy to. I mean, I think it's. I mean, I take your point, Mike, that there's a lot. It's a starting point for a discussion. Things aren't going to because, for example, when you were talking about case management, it wasn't immediately what sprung to my mind in terms of active interventions. I was thinking more of prevention and how prevention at one side, and tenancy sustainment and those kind of measures, and housing first at the other, which are mentioned in the report. But you're quite right, case management of a particular kind is absolutely active, but it isn't always. Quite often it is, certainly in our experience, about kind of just helping people survive where they are at the moment. And very often those survival skills are required because of the nature of the emergency accommodation that we put people in, so you're trying to survive in hostels or congregate settings of various kinds, and it's quite different skills you need to be rehoused. But I think there's been a bit of analysis of there's been a couple of quite revealing projects done over the last few years about the nature of homelessness spend in England, particularly. My colleague Glenn Bramley's done a comparison across different parts of the UK. And there's a consultancy, actually from a sort of centre-right think tank, who did some quite interesting work as well on homelessness spend. And in some ways it picked up on that same theme, but I don't think that the way that the data has been presented is quite as accessible as the way you're putting it. And I think in some ways that presenting it, I mean, I know dichotomies get a bad name sometimes, but I think they are helpful for people to kind of grasp onto what the fundamental issue is. And I think from that point of view, it's really helpful. But like I said, what that's tended to show is in England, the absolute amount of money spent on homelessness has actually gone down. And again, it depends on how you define these things. Our expenditure on homelessness authorities and local authorities have been really hard hit by austerity, so they've cut their spending on virtually everything except their core statutory duties. Of course, they do have core statutory duties on homelessness, and those are to provide temporary accommodation, and those fall in London. So you have this really certainly one of the key findings is in England the overall amount of money spent on homelessness has gone down, even as homelessness has gone up, and it's become increasingly concentrated on temporary accommodation. And I think using this terminology of a shift from more active interventions, or resourcing more active interventions, to resourcing passive interventions is a really nice way of making that point that politicians and others will probably grasp more easily than the way it's been presented thus far. So I think that's really helpful. In terms of Glenn's comparison across the different UK countries, I mean, what it tended to show was that well, it captured that same pattern in England, but actually the amount of money spent on homelessness has been pretty stable and was increased in Wales. Well, it's kind of gone down a bit in Scotland, but nowhere near as much as it has in England. And I think in both Wales and Scotland, you've partly got more kind of protection against austerity for various reasons, but also what you've got is much stronger, it was pre the HRA, much stronger statutory frameworks around homelessness. In other words, local authorities were obliged to spend money on homelessness because they had these core statutory duties. And I think for me that reinforces the importance of the legal framework in driving not just culture change but resource allocation, certainly in the UK, certainly in local authorities. And if you talk to, I mean, I always think it's quite interesting, you talk to local authority homelessness, people that work in the homelessness parts of local authorities, they want increased statutory duties because it helps in those internal debates around, battling with your chief exec's office, whatever, for funding. If you can say, I've got a statutory duty to do this, it helps protect that funding. If you take those statutory duties off local authorities, then the money goes elsewhere. But I think that distinction, I mean, I take the point that it's not quite as straightforward as a kind of, you have to work out what lies behind it, but I do think it's one that is potentially quite powerful, and I haven't seen it used in the UK.
And I think it's quite interesting that here we don't have that obligation. There's much more discretion around for local authorities in terms of access to emergency accommodation, and yet the spending has increased. So it's kind of a very different story, and a very different, almost an opposite when you look at that figure 20, as you were mentioning. But I suppose in terms of that, I might put it to Owen and to Mike. Is something to do, is the way in which we're spending money on emergency accommodation in Ireland, is that led by our perceptions of homelessness and what homelessness means? And do we need to kind of, I suppose, as a society more generally, kind of educate ourselves a little bit more around, homelessness not just being rough sleeping, but all of that hidden homelessness and all of that which we struggle to kind of define and to shape and to properly kind of capture, because the figures are just those point in time monthly figures. So do you think that the way in which we're spending money is a reflection perhaps of how we kind of conceptualize homelessness in Ireland?
I'm not so sure it's about how we conceptualize it. I think what we have been good at is ensuring that extraordinary number of people who experienced homelessness over the last 6 or 7 years didn't rough sleep. So our rough sleeper numbers have remained relatively low over that period. Because our funding simply follows the more people flow into homelessness. We have provided more congregate accommodation by the NGO sector. We saw the development of family hubs, congregate facilities for families. I don't know, was it 21 or 22 new congregate facilities on top of the extraordinary expenditure on private emergency accommodation. So I think the expenditure is very much driven by that political concern. And the budget for next year will be higher again. We know the Section 10 funding, that is the contribution from central government, is up again for 2021. And local authorities have to make a further contribution. So the spend this year will be higher again, I would think. So it's not like the UK, as Suzanne's pointed out, but there is a fixed budget. It literally increases every year as required to service the needs of emergency accommodation. And I think that's why Mike, in this discussion around this issue about how we make that shift from congregate emergency accommodation, private sector accommodation, to those active measures that can prevent homelessness, and it's kind of that issue, kind of following the money, that even if people aren't particularly concerned about the issue or think of homelessness in a particular way, certainly this was the argument made in the United States around things like Housing First, that people are always a bit puzzled. It was the Bush administration that really pushed Housing First. And it was partly based on selling it as a cost-effective intervention. So partly, I think, for the public to see, well, this is how much money we spend on keeping people in emergency accommodation. So even if you're not motivated by concerns of social justice, there may be other concerns. Well, surely we can do much better with that kind of expenditure in providing services for people.
Does anybody else want to come in on that? Or?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the challenges we have in discussing this, Folks Islanders always argue that shelter isn't the answer to homelessness, and so this huge expansion of the shelter sector, as they call it in the States, is something we've been critical of. There's a risk in saying that you're sort of implying that some certain group of people should have been allowed to sleep rough because you're saying that those things shouldn't be provided. So we're obviously not saying that. The being able to have a roof, some sort of shelter is absolutely crucial. It's just the inability to think beyond the immediate week by week thing of, we've got an extra, 100 people here, we need to open another shelter. Relates, I think, to one of the points that Suzanne made about who are these people, which is worth, or where are they staying? Like for the single people, these are emergency shelters. They aren't mainstream housing virtually entirely for single people. They may be single rooms, maybe even with their own facilities. Mostly they'd be single rooms with shared facilities, bathrooms and so on, but there's still a significant amount of dormitory accommodation left in the system. If they're in one of the services provided by NGOs, generally they would have some form of, within a very wide range of what we mean by it, case management and other supports. But if they're in the private emergency, it's basically a bed, and during COVID, bed and a breakfast is what they were receiving, and there's no additional supports for them in the private sector. There's shifts in that now of case managers from the local authority going in Dublin, but they were really people who were sort of very much left to their own. Families, it's slightly different, and virtually all the families that count as homeless in these figures are living in some form of, especially congregate homeless shelters for families, which we call family hubs, which have some of them have reasonable, most of them have reasonable accommodation, and they have support. But there was one of the changes that was made over the period, which is referred into the document, is the government decided unilaterally that families who were being given temporary accommodation in mainstream housing, even though they were still considered homeless in relation to how the funding was coming from and the local authorities' engagement to them, they were taken out of the data. So it explicitly for families only includes those forms of accommodation which was specifically designated for homelessness. And if you're put as a homeless person for a short time in a local authority or a private rented accommodation on a short-term emergency basis, you're not included in those figures. And that had, I think, significant effects, not just in the sector, but in the media and so on, of undermining the credibility of the data. because the government did that on their own without an adequate explanation, and nor did they restate the data having changed the basis. And the irony of that, of course, is when that's probably why there's much less public awareness of the fact that there was a decline in homelessness happened before COVID, in family homelessness before COVID, because people just missed it because they began to not believe in the data. So in order to present a more positive picture, the government of the day made decisions which actually undermined the positive story they actually legitimately could tell just a few months later. And I think there ought to be lessons from that.
Rosemary, could I just chip in here to make sure I'm clear? And so from what Owen and Mike are saying, there's been pretty significant expansion in congregate stroke shelter type provision over the last few years, which, you know, I find quite shocking actually in a way, because that means that I do find it quite shocking, because that means that figure 20 is all the more shocking, because it isn't paying for mainstream ordinary housing that people are occupying on an emergency basis, but it's paying for provision which is very far from ordinary housing in most instances, as I understand it. So I think that's a very retrograde step, and it is very different actually from in the UK, where say our overall expenditure on homelessness has dropped in England, but the expenditure on temporary accommodation has gone up. So in that sense, it is similar, and it isn't a fixed budget. It is, because it's driven by statutory duties, that money follows the people. It just means that the money's taken out because they have to pay for the temporary accommodation. The money's taken out of other more constructive kind of interventions that they could spend on. But because it's provided by local authorities, nobody in those figures is in shelters. Shelters are provided by sort of churches and things separate from the statutory system. So it would be a combination of a small proportion, maybe less than 10% at any one point in time would be in bed and breakfast hotels. There'd be another maybe 10% or so in hostels, but 70, 75%, 80%, and almost all families would be in ordinary housing, provided either through the private rented sector or through social housing. So although we're spending money on temporary accommodation, and it's expensive in London in particular because it's private sector leasing and so on, people, and certainly there'll be issues about quality, but we're not spending vast amounts of money to keep people in congregate shelters. I mean, that isn't, so in that sense, it's a very different picture between the UK and Ireland. And it sounds like there's some very retrograde stuff that's happened recently. And we know from looking across the world really, that once you set up shelters and so on, it can be very difficult to get rid of them. There's a certain amount of path dependency. So it sounds to me like there really is quite a important agenda here to try and reverse what's happened, and to ensure that you move towards that housing focused approach, that you know, that household focus within the data, the point you've been emphasising, Mike, is so important for.
Thanks, Suzanne. I don't know if Owen or Mike, have you any final comments to make there, or will we wrap up?
Yeah, just on Suzanne's point, yeah, yes, all of these households that we're counting there are all in emergency congregate accommodation provided by NGOs or B&B hotel type accommodation. So it doesn't include people in normal housing. This is all emergency accommodation in that narrow definition of emergency accommodation. So, and I said, I can't remember the figures, that 700 families were taken out of the data because they were in own door accommodation, that they had a license to be in standard housing. But I think they were also then counted, so while they were taken out of the monthly figures, they were counted as successful exits in another set of data. So it was a bit confusing. So yeah, so your point is very well made, and maybe we need to be just a bit more explicit, because I think in a number of other countries as well, what we call own door accommodation or standard housing, but with a license rather than perhaps than a tenancy, is used to accommodate households. The people we're all talking about in this data are all in emergency accommodation.
So Rosemary, just the last thing I would say is what I had actually meant to say right at the beginning, is to thank our co-author, Aisling Reedy, who is on well-deserved annual leave this week. Owen and I, this objective of making sure that there's just statement of facts and not analysis is not can be quite a blunt instrument. So I think we went back and over text many times. So So Aisling did a great job in bringing in as a co-author on this. So just want to give her credit. So that's my last contribution.
Really, thanks so much, Mike, and thanks to all our panelists today and all our speakers. That was a really interesting discussion, and I think hopefully the start of many discussions to come around what this research means and what, kind of looking at the data in this way, what we can do with it from a policy perspective, and how we can hopefully address some of the points that you've made today, and in a more progressive way. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you to everyone for coming. And if you have any questions or you'd like access to the report, please do get in contact with us after this as well. Thanks, everyone.